Today we'll be doing a tutorial on how to do the Vertigo effect in Toon Boom Premium. A little disclaimer, this tutorial can only be completed in the premium version of Toon Boom as it uses tools that are only found in the premium version, such as the node view, node library, and camera field of view settings. To get started, you want to create 3 drawings on 3 separate drawing layers in the timeline. To create a drawing layer, press Ctrl R or right-click on the timeline and go to Insert, Drawing. It's important to have 3 separate layers because we will be turning these into the foreground, middle ground, and background. You can draw on these layers by using the brush tool or the pencil tool. The pencil tool will create a path, whereas a brush tool will create a shape. Or alternatively, you can import art that you've created in other programs such as Illustrator or Photoshop. I'll be using art that I've created elsewhere and bringing it in. I've previously created a Photoshop file with a middle ground and background layer that I will be importing. To do this, go to File, Import, and then Images. Click on Browse and navigate to your Photoshop file. Under Layer, make sure Create Layers based on file names is ticked, and click OK. Next, under Create, select individual layers and set the transparency to straight, and click OK. You will now have the separate layers of your Photoshop file in the timeline. You'll want to resize these layers to fit the stage. Do this by clicking the layer and then clicking the Scale tool found in the Advanced Animation toolbar. If you don't see this, go to Windows, Toolbars, and Advanced Animation. A red bounding box with yellow squares will appear around your layer. While holding Shift, click and drag one of these yellow boxes in the corner to resize the layer and fit the size of your stage. You can turn on the Camera Mask tool to make it easier to see the stage. Do this with your middle ground layer and your background layer. Next, I'll import my foreground layer, which is a vector file that I created in Illustrator. I've chosen to use a vector for the foreground layer because later on when we zoom in, we don't want it to lose its image quality. Importing an Illustrator file is a little bit trickier and requires a few things to be done beforehand. First, make sure you can see your Library tab. If you can't, click on the plus button on one of your windows and go down to Library to enable it. You need to make sure that the library you are saving the Illustrator file into is unlocked. By default, the library will be called Harmony Premium Library, and it will probably have a little lock on the icon. We need to turn this off by right-clicking and clicking Write to Modify. You can now import Illustrator files to this library. If your Illustrator file consists of a character with multiple layers, you will have to change a setting when you're saving the actual Illustrator file. When saving, make sure the version is set to be compatible with Illustrator CS2, otherwise your layers will flatten and you won't have them anymore. And make sure Create PDF Compatible File is ticked as well. Once you have your Illustrator file saved properly, you can import it into Harmony by right-clicking on the Harmony Premium library and going to Import Files. Or, alternatively, clicking on File, Import, SWF Illustrator Files to Library. Navigate to your Illustrator file and click OK. It'll ask you to enter a name. I just use the default. Now your Illustrator file will be in your library. Drag and drop it into your scene. It'll ask you if you want to perform color recovery. Click Yes. This will import the colors used in your Illustrator file into your color palette library. Now resize your foreground layer or character to the size you want it within your scene. Next, we'll adjust the playhead on the timeline to change how long the animation is. Do this by grabbing the red handle and dragging it to the frame that you want. My animation is set to 25 frames per second, and I want my animation to go for 3 seconds, so that's 75 frames. If your animation is set to the default 24 frames per second, just multiply that by the amount of seconds that you want. To extend your layers so that they are visible for the duration of the animation, click the final frame and shift-click down through your layers. This will select them all, and then press F5 to extend them. Next, you want to create a camera. You can do this a couple of different ways. Right-click in your Layers window and go to Insert Camera, or click on the plus icon in your Layers window and select Camera. Now we must add a peg to the camera to animate it. Right-click on the camera layer and go to Insert Peg. You might get a pop-up saying, "Cannot add peg in this display mode. Change to Display All mode." If this happens, go to Windows, Toolbars, and then click on Display. There will now be a drop-down box in the top left corner of the screen. Change this to display all, and try again. You should see a new layer above your camera layer. This is the peg. The peg will be used to move your camera around. Next, select the top window so we can have an aerial view of our scene. If you don't see this, click the plus icon on one of your windows and go down and select top. We're going to separate our layers by moving the foreground layer forward and the background layer back while leaving the middle ground layer where it is. Click Maintain Layer Size in the Advanced Animation toolbar. This will make sure our layers maintain their size in the camera view as we push them back or move them forward. Make sure the first frame is selected on the timeline. Then, select your foreground layer or character and move it forward a little bit in the top view. Do the same for your background layer, but move it back. Now select your camera peg from your layers and press F6 to give it a keyframe on the first frame in your timeline. With the peg still selected, navigate to the last frame in your timeline and press F6 again. Select the Translate tool from your Advanced Animation toolbar. In your top view, push the camera peg in so that it frames your foreground or character nicely. If done correctly, your camera should now be animated. Head back to the first frame and press play to see what you've got. I want my camera to push in and hold, so I'll select the last frame of the camera peg and copy and paste it onto frame 50. Next, with your camera peg selected, click the Set Ease Type drop-down box. This is located above the timeline and looks like a box with a line in it. Select the S-shaped easing for a nice slow in and slow out. This will apply this easing to all the keyframes on your camera peg. Press play to have a look. Next, right-click on your camera layer. Make sure not to click on the camera peg layer, but the actual camera layer, and go to Layer Properties. Click the box to override Scene Field of View. And click the blue squiggly line box next to Field of View to bring up the Bezier editor. Where it says Frame, enter 1 and press Enter. Under Value, enter whatever the default field of view was. Mine was 41.1121. Press the plus KF button in the Bezier editor. This will create a keyframe. In the timeline, navigate to frame 50. Change the value to 10 less than the default was. Mine is now 31.1121. Hit the plus KF button again to create another keyframe. Close the editor and the layer properties. Select the camera layer and again set the ease type to S to match your camera peg easing. Because we adjusted the field of view, your camera's framing might be in a different position when it finishes moving. If it does, with your camera peg selected, in your main window, select Translate and move it so that the framing is where you want it again. On the camera peg layer, copy and paste the frame where the camera stops on frame 50 and paste it to the final frame of your animation so the camera stays static. Next, open up the node view and the node library. If you don't see them, select a window and click the plus button and open them from there. I'm going to tidy up my node view by rearranging some things so it's easier to look at. Next, in your node library, select Filter and then select the Blur Gaussian. Drag and drop it into your node view. Do this twice so you have two Blur Gaussian nodes. While holding Alt, select one of your blur nodes and drag it between your background node and your composite node. Holding Alt will connect these nodes together. Do the same for the other blur node, but instead this time dragging it between the middle ground layer and the composite layer. This will place a couple of blur Gaussian effects on your timeline, one attached to your background layer and one attached to your middle ground layer. With the first frame of your animation selected, click the blur effect attached to your middle ground layer. Press F6 to add a keyframe. Now go to frame 50 and add another keyframe by pressing F6. With frame 50 still selected, click the plus next to the blur effect. Enter the value next to blurriness as 1 and press Enter. With the blur effect still selected, click on the Set Ease drop-down box and select the S-curve. This will match the easing of your camera. Now repeat these steps, but instead for the blur effect attached to the background layer. Click the Render and Play icon above the timeline to see your results.